titled Dragon Slaying, Meeting the Challenge of Grey Zone Competition. My name is Tanya Beckett. It's great to have you with us. Now, unless you've been hiding behind a sofa all week, and you might be entitled to do that, you'll have noticed that the G7 nations have been meeting, and they've identified as their top 3 threats the pandemic, of course, but also Russia and China. Now, the threat posed to the West from those 2 countries, of course, is very different in shape. But I thought it was very notable that in the some 12,000 word communique that was issued, it was very light indeed on how to meet that challenge. Are they hiding their pearls of wisdom, or do they perhaps not have a clue? Well, the answer is here this afternoon. You'll know that at the center of this webinar is a paper beautifully written by Alex Wilson, which outlines exactly how to deal with that threat. And that's what we're discussing today. If you haven't had a chance to read it, then I suspect that the next hour will inspire you to do that. Well, let me introduce you now to our 4 panelists who will be enlightening us as to how to meet that challenge from Russia and China. We have, as promised, Alex Wolfson, who, as I've said, wrote the paper. And also we have Karen von Hippel, who is from RUSI. We have Simon Hazelock, who is from Albany Associates, one of the co-founders. And we also have Graham Given there as well, who joins us from Northern Ireland. Welcome to all of them. Well, I'd like first of all to hand over to Alex so he can tell us a little bit more about what it says in the paper. But let me give you a little bit of background on him. There's plenty of military background and also experience in conflict zones, and more particularly communicating in conflict zones from our panelists this afternoon. But Dr. Alexander Wolfson, to be precise, is the Defence and Security Editor for the comment website The Article, but also he is a visiting professor at the National Defence University in Argentina, and I've said is author of the paper that underlies today's webinar. Alex, over to you.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Tanya, for those opening words. I'm going to make the briefest of introductions. I can't cover the whole paper in 5 minutes, but I do want to give you some of the headlines. The main thrust of this paper is to place the findings of the integrated review into the context of both Russian and Chinese activity. And I'm going to do this by suggesting that the principal form of persistent competition from Russia and China is narrative-based political warfare. We in the West fail to understand this because our conception of the grey zone has become a little too grey. Until we see Russian and Chinese political warfare as more than just disinformation, we will never truly grasp the strategic objective of our adversaries. The Global Britain paper explicitly recognized the centrality of competition between states over interests, norms, and values. And I think that is really the key point. Competition now is in large part ideational, a war over meaning. In other words, over narratives. Whilst the integrated review recognized the centrality of these cognitive domains, I think it has been far less successful in actually articulating what persistent competition looks like. The ideas and values in the Global Britain paper cannot just be asserted. Ideas by themselves aren't enough, since they don't invite action, at least not until they are given structure and meaning through narrative. Ideas may be true or false. Narratives, as our adversaries know, do not have to rely on truth value for their success. The West finds itself at an unusual inflection point because the long period of consensus politics is over. In its place, the idea that mobilizes the political masses in the West now is the perception that group dignity has somehow been disparaged or disregarded. This is the politics of identity and grievance. And these ideas, by the way, are equally present in the narratives of China and Russia. Western reaction has so far been inadequate because we persist in categorizing grey zone operations as a form of military threat, shoehorning all adversarial activity either above or below the threshold of armed conflict. There's a very real risk here of conceptual encirclement. China, in particular, has broadened her definition of war beyond armed force and non-armed force, military or non-military. The Western binary of above or below the threshold of war is simply no longer relevant. The danger is that we are unable to even perceive the entire range of Russian and Chinese activity. There are, of course, differences in the approach that both China and Russia utilize. Russia has broadly used negative destabilizing influence operations, whereas China has been far more subtle and chosen broadly positive narratives about the beneficial, cooperative nature of her rise as a world power. Their differing narratives are reflected in the shape of their operations, where Russia has often been motivated seemingly by tactical opportunism. China focuses on long-term advantage to drive a fait accompli, often without the chance for explicit early detection or response. It should be clear that there is a strategic disconnect in grammar between the UK and her adversaries. The UK treats sub-threshold areas as distinct domains, apparently believing that they can be used in a non-escalatory fashion. I think that the UK has to move away from thinking about so-called sub-threshold domains as if they exist independently of ground strategy. Part of the problem that has led to this somewhat confused response in the UK is that it remains unclear as to who does UK ground strategy. The remedy was meant to be Lord Sedwell's fusion doctrine. Much like our Chinese and Russian competitors, we were meant to take a whole of government approach to strategy. While some advancement has been made in that area, I don't think that Global Britain yet represents a coherent, joined-up idea, nor a fully integrated strategy. I think it's both unreasonable and inappropriate to lay this task solely at the feet of the armed forces, at least in a democracy with civilian rule. It should not be their role. But whilst the Global Britain paper and the integrated operating concept identify the importance of grey zone operations and narrative, they really fail to define either. One is left with the impression that military primacy in the grey zone is the order of the day, and narrative an ill-defined afterthought. The point of this analysis is that Russia and China conceive of warfare in almost an entirely different fashion to us. Neither shares our conception of, for instance, of cyber operations as distinct from information warfare. It is this development in the information psychological sphere that is their real innovation. This conception of warfare is fundamentally concerned with influence, not domain, so that the threat we currently face is not over information or its transmission, rather over narrative. That is the meaning of the information. Narratives do not convey facts, rather they attempt to push a meaning for the facts to an audience. And this is a vital distinction. To fight disinformation with alternative information is counterproductive and simply puts you in a fight for legitimacy with your adversary. The only real way to prosecute a campaign concerned with identity and meaning is to provide more compelling narratives. We are still some way from realizing this goal. The relationship between global Britain as a concept and the values at the heart of liberal democracy have yet to really be defined. What is missing is a narrative. I can think of many potential narratives to fit the notion of global Britain, and not all of them are positive. As William Hague put it only 2 days ago, we need narratives that convince people at home and abroad to say, I want to be part of that. Thank you very much.
Alex, thank you very much indeed to you. So the power of the narrative really is the centre of the answer, certainly as far as Alex is concerned. I should have said perhaps at the beginning that all of our panellists are going to give brief statements and then we'll go into the Q&A after that. So we would like from you, the audience, some questions in order to fuel that Q&A. So please start typing those in now. Let me turn now to Karen von Hippel. I mentioned at the beginning that she's the Director General of RUSI and has been actually for 6 years. Prior to that, she was at the State Department in the United States and a senior advisor on counterterrorism. She has extensive experience concerning conflict zones and communication in conflict zones. Karen, over to you.
Thank you, Tanya, and thank you for inviting me. Thank you to Albany in particular. And some of those conflict zones, I have worked with both Simon and General Rob Fry, who is They're both part of Albany. So it's a pleasure to be here today with all of you. I think it's an incredibly important subject, and it's a subject that I've wrestled with for years. I'm not a communications expert, but I think I know enough to know that we're not doing it right. So I, definitely agree with Alex that it's important. But I guess the challenges that I want to raise today relate to just some fundamentals that I think we need to get right if we are going to construct narratives that get the right type of buy-in. And then I will look forward to hearing more from my fellow panelists who are experts in this area. So I think I want to raise three challenges in my opening remarks about the difficulties in creating or constructing narratives. And now the first one I would say is it's very difficult today, in particular, to construct a narrative that will be embraced by enough people. Lord Haig is right. You do want it to be embraced, but I find it incredibly hard to do because not only are we living in a more complex, multipolar world that I'm not sure any of our governments have been able to, let's just say, explain to the publics how they're going to work in this far more complex world that we're living in, but our own societies are deeply divided. Now, I think it's far worse in the UK. It's far worse in the United States right now than it is in the UK, but it certainly is divided here in the UK as well. And we do know that different people buy into different views. We know that people consume different news. I think that, again, is worse in the US than it is in the UK, but they often operate in completely different silos. And so it's not clear to me how you construct a narrative that will get enough buy-in across the board. I think even if you think about healthcare workers in this country, encouraging them to get vaccinated is already a challenge in and of itself for some communities. So there's definitely different narratives, and the narratives are being constructed all over the world, but they're being consumed at home and abroad. So I think the first part is just we're incredibly divided, and so it's hard to imagine how do you get a narrative that countries will buy into or that your publics will buy into. And I think perhaps Alex, Simon, and Graham might have better answer than I do. But then the second related question is if you look at Russia and China today, and all of our governments, Western governments, G7 governments, are all recognizing that we need to view Russia and China as both adversaries, but also as occasional partners. And so we do need to look at these countries in a more nuanced fashion than perhaps we have in the past. And so, as Tanya mentioned at the start, if you look at that G7 document, it's quite lengthy, but you can see that they're having difficulties trying to explain what does that mean in practice. Now you add on to that complex, the difficulties explaining that to the fact that most people I would say in most of our countries anyway, aren't that interested in foreign policy. And so it's a smaller group that will be very interested, but you still need to explain your policy to the larger audience that's a little bit less interested. Now I know the integrated review was an attempt to define Britain's new role post-Europe, post-Brexit, preparing the UK to go it alone in case America is no longer a reliable partner, as it was not during the Trump administration. So that's sort of the second issue, is it's just more complex to explain foreign policy. It's no longer the evil empire. It's far more nuanced. And then I think the third and related point is we don't always live up to our own values. We don't live up to what we advocate in our own narratives. And this hypocrisy is noted, and it's aired, and we hear it by foreign governments. If I can just use another American example, the Biden administration is trying to encourage Myanmar to respect the results of the election, or Russia not to jail Navalny. And then you look at what happened in the US on the 6th of January, and they can say, yeah, who are you to talk? Or you hear, I think as Alex mentioned earlier in his paper, at the summit in Anchorage, Alaska, between the US and the Chinese pushed back very hard on human rights abuses with a response about Black Lives Matter. So we need to be very aware that we don't always live up to our own values in our own narratives. And so I think being more humble about it and recognizing that it is imperfect. I think as Tony Blinken did this morning on Radio 4 is a positive approach, but certainly not all leaders will follow that approach. So anyway, I'm going to stop there, Tanya, because I'm looking forward to hearing from the others, and then I'll jump back in a bit later.
Karen, we look forward to that. Thank you very much indeed, Karen von Hippel there. Well, living up to your own narrative is something, of course, which has become an issue in Northern Ireland. You're no doubt aware that there's been an uptick in violence in Northern Ireland, which has been very much linked to the border being erected, to the extent it is being erected, in the Irish Sea, and concerns about that, and of course the departure of Arlene Foster as well. So our next panelist can talk us through a little bit more on that. His name is Graham Given. Now, he is a strategic risk management consultant for Churton Secure in Northern Ireland, but really he speaks to us as through his voluntary work, which is done with the Belfast Activity Centre. There are multiple efforts, of course, within Northern Ireland at the moment to try to talk to young people at the centre of this violence and try to persuade them not to go down the path that we saw before 1998. So I'm looking forward to hearing what Graham has to say about his experiences in Northern Ireland. Graham, welcome to you.
Thank you, Tanya, and thank you, Simon, and the rest of the team for the invite today and the opportunity to speak to you. Really just to convey the concerns around a worrying shift within loyalism that we've seen through the work with the charity. I suppose right from the offset, identity is right at the heart of everything in Northern Ireland, where there are two very distinct and opposing narratives being played out. On the loyalist side, we have people who believe that they're British and they want to remain British, but the introduction of the NI protocol has thrown this horrible issue in the middle, where they now feel that they are under threat and that the union will no longer survive. So that has brought young people, brought people out onto the streets and caused the rioting. And as a charity, we've been trying to steer people away from the streets and give them alternatives. But the loyalist leaders that I've been speaking to have been linked to the UDA in North Belfast. And they've made it very clear to me that the tensions that they're seeing in their community are now at the highest that they've experienced really since the signing of the Good Friday Agreement back in 1998. They describe their community as being a tinderbox ready to ignite. And that's quite concerning for everyone here in Northern Ireland, because the last thing we want to do is see more images splashed across the world of children on the streets rioting. When they turn around, and they can be quite scary people, and say enough is enough and that they're no longer going to sit back and do nothing, people do start to sit up and listen. The most worrying thing for me is the message that's coming out of the young people, that they now see violence as a way of actually achieving their political aims. And this has come about through three quite significant incidents or issues that have raised its head over the last year. The first one being the Bobby Story funeral, and the second one, the Irish Sea border as a result of the NI protocol. And the last one, this new idea, concept that is being put out there, that there is actually two-tier policing in Northern Ireland. And so maybe if I touch on the three and the three areas and just try and introduce what has been taken away to feed this new narrative within loyalism. The first one, the Bobby Story funeral. Bobby Story, senior IRA commander, during his funeral through West Belfast, there was a large contingent of Sinn Féin councillors, politicians. The streets were lined with over 1,000 people, all paying their respects. But this actually infuriated the loyalist community. They saw it as a failure on the part of policing to prevent such a large gathering during the COVID restrictions. And also then subsequently a failure on their part to investigate and bring anybody to prosecution. So that has been held up as an example within loyalism, where Sinn Féin are trying to show everybody who runs Northern Ireland, and at the same time potentially manipulating and controlling policing within Northern Ireland. So that was the first one. The next big issue, really, the NI protocol and the Irish Sea border. During the EU negotiation for exit, there was a big concern and a big fear put forward that should there be something like a hard border north and south, then this would mean a return to extreme violence and attacks from dissident Republicans along the border. In the eyes of politicians, naturally that is not something that we would have wanted. And the compromise was a regulatory customs arrangement down the Irish Sea. But with the implementation of the Irish Sea border, the Loyalist community saw this as one step closer to United Ireland and have actually withdrawn their support to the Good Friday Agreement. And as a result, use that as an example to stimulate the fear internally within their community. The last one then is this idea of two-tier policing. Policing has always been politicised in Northern Ireland, and it's just part of the territory, people would say, but now it's being politicised within loyalism, and it's seen that loyalists are getting a harder deal. Police have been extremely successful against the criminality recently within East Belfast UVF and East Antrim UDA, and bringing quite a significant number hopefully to court. But loyalism has traditionally remained outside the national security portfolio and has been dealt with by police. These groups are now pushing back against the police and creating this story that they're being hard done by and that loyalism and the Protestant community is being hard done by. And I suppose my biggest fear is that, well, where does this end? Where does this narrative finish? Is it a case that they will be able to present an image and a picture to loyalists that police are actually a legitimate target? Well, hopefully not. But so those are the three areas that have changed. Those are the three areas that have brought kids out onto the street, and we're quite likely to see quite a heated summer. And in summary, really, the points that the loyalists have taken away from this to feed their narrative is politics has failed, and politicians have failed them and betrayed them, and that they're now one step closer to a united Ireland. And so when it comes to the grand narrative that we're talking about, Northern Ireland is a very multi-layered location. It has many half-truths feeding the narrative. And for those who are involved in creating the grand narrative, all I can say is good luck. But we have to get it right at home first before we can sell anything successfully abroad. So thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to catching up later.
Graham, thank you very much indeed. So yes, there was a narrative. It's just that that narrative has been betrayed, and perhaps it wasn't a strong enough narrative in the first place. We'll come back to that. Let me now hand over to Simon Hazelock. As I mentioned, he's one of the co-founders of Albany Associates, but also, and during that time with his work with Albany, he's worked in Africa, the Middle East, Eastern Europe. Prior to that, he was an officer in the Royal Marines for 23 years and was running some very groundbreaking communications in the Balkans during the conflict in the Balkans in the 90s. And if you can run communications there, I would argue you can probably do it anywhere. Simon, over to you.
Thanks very much, Tanya, and thanks very much for everybody else. I intend to sort of run relatively quickly through what I'm going to say, because I think it's important that we have time for questions. So perhaps if I put a few themes out there. So the first one, I think, is are we serious? And one of the reasons why we decided to go for this and commission this paper from Alex was to focus on that question. There's a lot of discussion about the threat, and many of the things that we talk about in terms of the threats posed by sort of autocratic actors are not necessarily new. And we agonize about them to quite a high level, but we've not really started to talk seriously about how to address them. And when you see what we've already heard from Alex and others and Karen about the sort of extent of the threat in terms of the activity, the whole of state approach that is certainly Russia and China's goal, we realize that we're not necessarily taking it seriously. And this idea of a whole of society, a whole of state has not really been a place where the West has been focused as much since the sort of heart of the Cold War. So I think the first thing is that are we serious, and don't we need to get a bit more serious about it? The next point is to sort of look at, what do we mean by narrative? And it might seem obvious to everybody, but in the context of this, it's we're talking about it slightly more than just a storyline. But when we talk about stories, it is our story. It is the story that we stand for. It's the story that stands behind everything that we do. I suppose in military terms, it's both a mission statement, the aims and objectives, and the call to action. I mean, it's the sort of thing that underpins everything. And as we've already heard, and not least of which from what Graham has been saying, is it's got to be based in reality, but it still has to have some aspiration. So you can argue that part of the global narrative, Britain's global narrative, is under threat when we can't necessarily get that narrative right for the United Kingdom as a whole. The elections today will tell us something about how convincing that narrative is. And the other thing is it's an emotional thing. It's not about facts and figures. And some of our attempts to counter nationalist tendencies have been based upon sort of trying to present economic arguments factually. When you're going against emotions and feelings, this is a very, very difficult area. And so the narrative has to have emotional reach and appeal to feelings. And it's created by a collection of themes and stories. But we mustn't ever forget that they are reinforced by experience and attitudes of the people that they're aimed at, and therefore they must be real. So values and norms and the say-do gap is the next point I wanted to make. And we claim in the discussions about the future narrative or a narrative in this competitive space is based on values over interests. Some would argue that the autocratic adversaries are more pragmatic over interests and less concerned about values. To some extent, this is an old idea, and Karen has already spoken to this. As the hypocrisy of what we cling on to has been exposed. And if we are looking at the sort of post-Second World War idea of ourselves, it's looking a little jaded. Democracy is no longer universally aspired to, largely because we don't. We're perceived not to live up to what we say. So a lot of the discussion around this is now talking, and Alex refers to the paper, not in the expansion of democracy, but in the preservation of the status quo of the countries that are democratic. Our aspiration has already been modified by the notion that we need to sort of corral the Democrats rather than try to increase the amount of democracy around the world. And I think that's quite a lot. Where do China and Russia's narrative arcs fit into this? I think we've already pointed to the fact that I think Russia maybe is less of an existential threat, and its narrative perhaps focuses more to do with status of Russia and maybe even preserving Putin's position himself within his own target audiences. Obviously, it's vital to them and to the sort of Putin regime that its status in the world is respected. And so Russia on the rise, West in decline is a strong call for them. But that also applies to challenges more to China's more systematic challenge, which Rob Fry has written about what he calls purposeful autocracy as a description of what China's alternative is. It's a forward-leaning. They're not trying to pretend that they're quasi-democratic. There is a strength in autocracy because it gets things done, and it's a stronger system over liberal democracy. And they can point to things that make that sound credible, particularly in emerging markets or emerging continents like Africa. China's record in Africa and its activities in Africa are significant, and what they say has a good deal of credibility to the audiences. This idea of Chinese majoritarianism, if you like, is that system is better at raising the living standards of the majority. And why should we necessarily worry about the periphery? Why do we worry about minorities when actually it's about getting the majority to be better off in the end? Another thing that we point to is this distinction between information, disinformation, and narrative. And I think it's important to make that distinction because it affects the way you approach this. Information operations and disinformation operations are essentially the tactical tools that you deploy. It's the the area of maneuver, if you like. And so that, a lot of that perhaps does fall to a certain extent operationally within the military, although not all of it, obviously. But the narrative is a strategic tool, and it's the missions, objectives, goals, etc. It's the thing that achieves Haig's buy-in. You know, I could want to be part of that. It's much more of a call to action than it is a tactical sort of system. So information ops and disinformation ops are essentially about reinforcing or undermining those narratives. Next point quickly is an old one, but it's worth going through. Is this business about pace and volume, and I put in that slide the use of artificial intelligence, bots, and automation. I mean, the irony of social media is that it manifestly favors the autocrats. I mean, it's an irony because it was seen as this great tool or agency of democracy, but you know, obviously, if you can control that from the center, it's actually much more effective. And some of the most powerful social media tools we're seeing at the moment, like TikTok, for example, I mean, it's actually owned by China. And there's a lot of evidence to say how they have to put clandestine software into TikTok to sort of discover all sorts of bits of market information that they would like. Pace and volume is always the key. I mean, we know that the more something is repeated, the more it becomes true. And this spreads on these unregulated platforms that are sponsored or automated by Russia and China in particular, under the guise of freedom of expression, I mean, precisely because of this irony. It's ironic that they use freedom of expression as a justification for spreading this stuff. And they're used extensively by the Russian techniques and much more increasingly by Russia. I think it was interesting that I read the other day that bots surpass human social media posts. 95% of Russian and Chinese government retweets are from bots. This is a Carnegie paper. I mean, that's incredible if you think this is an automated response. And in looking at COVID in particularly, I think over 50% of the tweets that appear around COVID information are apparently estimated to have been generated from bots. And so that's again a hugely worrying statistic. Examples of the sorts of things. I mean, you don't need me, and we can talk about this in the questions, but don't need to be to point. But you know, obviously, COVID has provided a classic field for reinforcing the narratives of Western sort of chaos and decline. Or covering up and reinforcing the Chinese in particular, who have been very keen to sort of put this idea out that COVID originated in US weapons lab, for example, and it completely deflecting the focus on them. And then there's other, you know, that COVID was a cover for the effects of 5G, you know, that actually it's a sort of another. And these are the sorts of false bits of information that have caught on. And China, along the lines of the speech in Alaska, you know, Chinese have latched onto this anti-Asian theme in the US at the moment. I mean, there's been a lot, not least of which from the official government spokesman in China, you know, talking about US and the West anti-racist, anti-Asian racist position. The other thing that's obviously important to understand is this idea of implausible deniability that these governments are able to use. I mean, the denials don't have to be plausible; they just have to be denied and stuck to. And of course, that's so evident around things like Novichok, you know, the solar winds hack, and you know, all the stuff that's going on around Navalny at the moment. So. Russia works on this doctrine of perpetual adversarial competition in the information environment. It's a bit of a, so if we look at this graphic, this applies to the way sort of the Russian information ecosystem works, and it starts with official government statements. You know, they have you know, the official stuff, and it moves on to state-funded media, and we know what those are, and then proxy media outlets. And you know, here it's important to look at how Russian, pro-Russian oligarchs in Ukraine, for example, own vast chunks of the TV outlet and media outlets in Ukraine. and therefore they act as proxies for Russia. And it's interesting also how China, and a colleague of ours in Wits University in Johannesburg has written a book about how China has managed to infiltrate and acquire a lot of the regional media in Africa, for example. So they've moved very carefully to sort of find proxies in Africa, which they consider to be a place of strategic interest, obviously because of the, not least of which, because of the mineral capabilities. Next is the weaponizing social media, and we've talked about that and how that's done through automation, etc. And the next one, which is all the stuff that we've just mentioned, like cyber hacks, clones, and forgeries, the whole use of deep fakes, which that technology is now becoming, desktop available and very sophisticated, and the capture of other people's sites and pretending to be something that that they're not. China are increasingly learning from this playbook, and although I'm not disagreeing with the principle that they have had a much slower approach. Certainly recently around COVID and around the Black Lives Matter and these Asian attacks, you're beginning to see Chinese becoming increasingly front-footed and more aggressive in the way they do it. So anyway, I think we've left a little time, a good time for questions. So I just thought I'd show this last slide, which is a cartoon from the 1930s, which shows there's nothing new under the sun. And this is a cartoon about misinformation around smallpox. And you recognize the characters walking over the cliff are very similar to the way people are described these days. So, as ever, these things are not necessarily always new. Thank you very much.
Simon, thank you very much. So I think we've established really that part of the problem is that whereas Russia and China, for example, might have consistent narratives and they're fairly autocratic societies, the same cannot be said of the West. We're sometimes hypocritical, and certainly we have very fractured narratives. So how do we get round this problem? I think that's the question that might be at the heart of this. Do keep your questions coming in. I've got a few on the screen here. I might have to lean forward in a kind of weird way to read them. But your questions should be coming through the Q&A section and not through the chat, if that's okay, because we get confused that end. There's a couple of questions here which are talking about, one is from Dennis Gursky, I think, and there's an anonymous one as well, talking about two things. First of all, to what extent it's important to develop alliances with other countries. Ukraine in this particular context is mentioned, but also fragile countries. The Balkans, Simon, obviously where you have great experience, is somewhere which has been used quite a lot as a chessboard and is the source, I know, of a lot of social media misinformation as well. So Alex, just coming back to you, just because we haven't heard from you for a while because you started off, how important might it be then to get round this problem to build more international cooperation? That's sort of what the G7 was getting at, wasn't it?
Sure. One of the issues I touch on in the paper is what I see as the new structuring of international society. I think that the Biden administration has been very influenced by John Eikenberry's book, A World Safe for Democracy, where he sees a much more bounded, limited set of democracies globally, which I think has found its expression in the G7+3 that we've seen this week, or the D10 as it is likely to be announced next week. And I think what this means is that outside of this quite well-structured community of democracies, you see a lot of liminal states. And I should add to those democracies the Quad in Southeast Asia. But outside of that, you see sort of liminal states who teeter on the edge of not being necessarily fully aligned with the West, maybe not being fully democratic themselves, but not yet entirely aligned with either China or Russia. And I think in many ways that they probably represent the key battle zone. And I don't mean in a kinetic sense, I do mean in the sense of narrative warfare, the battle for influence, persuasion, co-opting them to join the club of democracies will be one of the great challenges going forward. So I see that as a key contested space, really, liminality on the boundaries of democracy.
Christian LeMay has written a question, which I think, if I may, Graham, I'll put to you, because I think Northern Ireland is somehow a blueprint for what we see elsewhere in the world. It's about the question of getting maybe multiple narratives. Does there need to be one narrative? You brought up the question of identity, which of course is central to the problem in Northern Ireland. But would you say that there could be multiple narratives, or does there need to be one in order to get this right?
I think there is going to be multiple narratives, particularly you mentioned Northern Ireland. There's the nationalists, the loyalists, but in any situation, I think it's key to get to the heart of it and what you know, giving the individual the voice so that they feel that their narrative is actually being listened to. And we come back to some of the questions that are all around liberal democracy and where we sit. And we do have the luxury that we are in a democracy. But the key piece here in Northern Ireland is the feeling sometimes that their voices, that individual voices are not being heard, or community voices are not being heard. So it's how do you unpick the various narratives? How do you deal with sometimes with the half-truths? And you know, go back to what was presented in the TV recently, where a young lad who was rioting was stopped by a journalist, asked, well, why are you rioting? And he said, well, it's because Bobby Story has just been released from prison. So how do you deal with that? You have to educate and you have to inform, but sometimes you have to sit back and listen and give the communities, particularly in Northern Ireland, or smaller nations, a voice and let them feel that they are being heard as well. So I'm not sure if that helps, but it's a feeling I have here, and what I'm seeing in Northern Ireland is a pushback because the politicians have been too busy dealing with the big politics stuff that they're missing out on the small politics, and that needs to be addressed.
Simon, any thoughts on that?
Well, I was just going to say that I often in the sort of the discussions around these sorts of things, I mean, people talk about, you know, you can't have the same narrative for everybody. Well, I mean, you know, that's a sort of fundamental mistake in my view. I mean, if you've got to have something that underpins everything. You may need sort of subtexts to explain it to different audiences in different ways. But if you have a narrative that, you know, is different for one person and then another, you then run the danger of having sort of mutual contradiction and the hypocrisy flows. So we need to be careful, I think, getting our own thoughts right and then making sure we can explain it and apply it to each of the target audiences in a way that they can comprehend and relate to is key to this. And I think sometimes, and I think Northern Ireland is a classic example of that, you know, we have got a broader grand narrative that sort of got the Brexit done, if you like, but it did not deal with the issues that were going to be confronted by, you know, Northern Ireland in particular and some others. Fishermen is another example, I suspect.
Yes, there is some tying up of details, I think it's fair to say. Karen, if I could come to you and ask you a sort of a question really that's coming in, it's informed in different ways, but it is really difficult to get a very hard narrative sometimes in Western democracies. Do you think that though there is a benefit to that a more pliable narrative it can be adapted over time and is more flexible, or is that a disadvantage? I mean, I'm thinking about Donald Trump. The narrative was really simple and it sold the idea to many people quite convincingly, didn't it?
It did, but many people didn't agree with it as well. And that was, you know, the divisions that I pointed out earlier. I think the challenge today is if you just look at Russia and China, finding a policy that works for both of those countries, that's coherent, has been an enormous struggle for all of our countries, for G7 countries in particular. If you look at the US policy to China over the last, well, since Nixon, it was all about strategic engagement. We'll engage with this country and it'll become more democratic and respect human rights, etc. And then I think Trump actually correctly recognized that this policy didn't work. I think the Obama administration started to understand that at the end, but they didn't publicly articulate that. It's similar with Russia. I think at the end of the Cold War, we all thought, oh, let's engage them and they'll, you know, be more like us. And neither of those approaches have worked. And there hasn't been a coherent policy that can replace those two policies that's in place. And I don't know if Simon would agree, but I would imagine you need policy first, and then you have the narrative around the policy that you can explain to people. And so it's more nuanced and gray, and it's very difficult for countries to say, well, China's a good guy sometimes and China's a bad guy sometimes. And I think people struggle with that a bit. And so, yes, narratives can be flexible, but they need to be coherent enough for people to understand them. And, you know, I'm not criticizing policymakers for struggling with this, because I think it's a difficult one. I think a coherent policy on Russia and China today is a difficult one to construct and to explain.
Sandra Kaduri, I think the name is, and Alex Beatty have asked a similar question, and that is, where does this narrative come from? And Karen's just highlighted, do we start with the policy and move to the narrative? There's a question, do we ask people? Do we poll people? Where does it come from, this narrative? Does it sit alongside policy? Does it define policy? Do we start with the narrative? Alex, I don't know if you'd be happy to answer that.
Sure. I mean, I make a very clear recommendation in the paper that I think there has to be cabinet level responsibility for these sorts of narratives. I don't think you can really start shifting further down the line and expect it to come straight out of government departments, no matter how well integrated they are. And there's a degree of political magic involved, I suppose, for want of a better word. Yes, public opinion research, partly focus groups, but also we elect our leaders to have some sense of being able to divine where public opinion lies. And I think really, in order for a narrative to be successful, you have to start looking to coherent political leadership, really. In the same way that we had, I draw this off the top of my head, the Truman Doctrine during the Cold War, for instance. You know, the declaratory doctrines of US presidents, I think, is the perfect sort of example for where we really start from in thinking about the order of magnitude and responsibility for where narratives really come from.
Simon, you talked about social media a little bit earlier, and of course that's a mechanism which has just really come into its own. I think particularly 2016, it was very noticeable indeed. Is the problem the narrative, or is it the means through which information is disseminated? And do we therefore need to engage private firms, Facebook, Google, and so on, to bring them on side?
Well, I've always maintained that, going back to what I said, this last slide, there's nothing new under the sun. And whatever the platform, it's the message, it's the content, it's the narrative that's the key. The social media, the thing that social media does is it actually enables you to propagate those messages much more quickly, much more dramatically, and it also enables you to spread, falsehoods much more easily. So, in answering your question, it is certainly the content is the king, and then you need to know how to use the tools, which are the social media sites. And yes, there is massive opportunity for cooperation with the industry and for the people whose job it is within commerce to sell ideas and sell products. I mean, this is where the West has always excelled, and it's again another irony that we are sort of being beaten at our own game, perhaps in this sort of narrative contest.
Here, I'm getting a comment that unless we have a mechanism that ends in an open and transparent way, how do we have a grand narrative to support that? I think at the heart of that question might be, how do we measure how we're doing in all of this? Graham, could I come to you, or Karen? How do you have any ideas as to how we measure how we're doing? Would it be levels of violence on the streets? I think, in your case, Graham?
Well, I think it's about buy-in, really, and credibility. Simon had touched during his presentation on COVID, and right from the offset of COVID, we had fantastic strap lines, but it's the detail, and the devil is always in the detail, and the army of civil servants behind the scenes making things work, and the proof in terms of buy-in is the acceptance, and I'm sure we'll see that the elections were mentioned today. We'll see the level of buy-in. But I do think that, in Northern Ireland, slightly different. People will quickly come onto the streets often recreational riding. It's sort of classed as, but this summer, I think over the next couple of months, we have a lot of work to do behind the scenes to try and maintain the sort of peace and to get buy-in from the key people within communities who have the influence. So yes, I think buy-in and credibility is a key within all of this.
Karen, there is an admission that China poses an economic threat, and that's really what Donald Trump was saying. So Biden is going to have to find a different way of expressing that and a different way of tackling it. Again, I would ask, how does he know how he's achieving something?
Yeah, I mean, I guess there are several ways of looking at that. It depends on the question. So I think with China, as much as they can work together to focus on issues of common concern, such as pandemics, such as climate change, and as much as it can forge agreements on trade or other issues. I think it was very difficult under Donald Trump because he was so erratic, and maybe being that way works well in the private sector, but I think in international security, countries need predictability. They need to understand what happens if a country acts in a certain way. But Tanya, can I pose a question to Simon actually about it's not about measuring impact, but it's more about how do we fight back these authoritarian countries that are, as you said, Simon, so much better than we are at, and they use our system to attack us, and they use our private sector, our companies such as Facebook or Twitter, whatever, and they're very good at it. How do we fight back when they're in our system and it's just our system is built to be so open that it's very easy for them to abuse it? I don't know how you fight back. I don't know how you address all the challenges that you raised when you're having authoritarian systems in much more open societies.
Simon.
If I had the answer to that question, I mean, I think, I mean, the problem, the question actually poses the dilemmas, I think, as much as the solutions. It's always much easier to identify the problems than the solutions to them. But I mean, I think one of the things that we have to be careful of is that it's part of the reaction is to sort of resort to sort of undemocratic sort of methods that sort of, or tit for tat sort of bans, which I think is a dangerous way to go, because I mean, at every level of experience that I've had in different things, is that the most important thing is to uphold the basis of what you stand for. So going back, if you want to go back to Northern Ireland, my time as a soldier, I mean, if you have to act within the rule of law, otherwise your basic reason for being there in the first place is destroyed. So a tit for tat banning of Chinese sites, or I think is going to get us nowhere. I think we have to be better at it than that, and I think we need to mobilize, the tech and the social media gurus that we have within our society, and get them to engage in this in a more effective way. And I think that in the end, that goes back to this buy-in. I mean, I think we are living in this sort of time when we're sort of depressed with ourselves and inward looking, and the West is pretty jaded in its opinion of itself, and I think we've got to give ourselves a little bit more enthusiasm, and then work on the tools. So I would go back to the fact that I think is the heart of this whole discussion, is that it's about the narrative, and it's about having some form of mobilizing idea and set of ideas which are backed up by policy, well, not backed up by policy, based on a policy and the delivery of policy that actually makes people believe in them. And I think this lack of belief in our system is at the center of the problem.
Alex, there was a question that had come in about fragile countries. Simon, I know that you've, as I highlighted at the beginning, you've spent time in the Balkans, and these sort of sponges for misinformation are very dangerous, aren't they? Would you see the propping up of, or the reinforcement of fragile countries as central to the building of a narrative, or at least the holding ground in a narrative?
Is that to me? Yeah.
No, it was to Alex, actually.
I sort of feel like I answered that in an earlier question, sort of covered the same ground. But I mean, the short answer is yes, I do. I think it's become, as I was saying, one of the these are precisely the countries which have become a sort of foundation of interstate conflict, proxy conflict, and I think that trend will only exacerbate. So yes, I think that's absolutely key.
It is the case, isn't it, with social media, though, that because of the pandemic, Facebook and Twitter and so on have taken a harder line about misinformation, as I would argue probably last summer they started doing that. So it feels, though, Karen, if I can ask you about that, it feels, I don't know how acceptable this is in the US, and there has been quite a battle, but how acceptable is it to co-opt the corporate sector into helping you with your narrative?
Well, we saw from Facebook today and yesterday that they're punting it back to the private sector. I do think it's quite extraordinary that we had several companies deciding to keep the president of the United States quiet in early January. It's quite extraordinary. We've never seen anything like that before. And the power of these companies that they can do that. And they haven't figured out how to manage it. So Facebook has set up this committee. Twitter has just banned Trump permanently, but we're in a very different space now, where we're talking about freedom of speech, but yet there is the freedom of speech issues here are outside the government's control.
Simon, there's a question come in about our domestic politicians, or maybe Graham would like to talk about this as well. They're too busy with thinking up their. This is Sandra Kaduri again. I'm sorry, Sandra, if I've pronounced your name wrongly. But they're too focused on appealing to specific targeted constituencies, not the whole. They are tribal in their approach, and this she suggests is part of the problem. Simon. Oh, Simon, you're on mute. Could you just unmute yourself so that we can get the benefit of your pearls of wisdom? Our politicians in the UK.
I think that this is again part of to a way, it's become, it's tools over narrative again. I mean, I think we've become so invested in the ability to segment target audiences through these digital tools that it becomes, mathematically, if you're trying to get elected, much easier to sort of target a particular group and say, well, we can ignore these groups. We just need to focus on the people who we can win with. And so I think, that is partly the problem. I think to win back, I mean, all politicians talk about sort of trying to unite the country or unite the West. And so therefore there has to be more thought given to sort of unifying ideas. And rather than trying to just appeal to the sort of the denominator that is going to get you elected. And I think that's a difficult one for politicians to buy into. But in the end, if they want policies to succeed, they need to get buy-in from the broader than just the sort of basis electorate, because if you're having sort of 50 or electoral success based upon less than 50% of the population, you might get elected, but you're not necessarily going to be able to deliver if you don't get buy-in from a broader basis of the population. So I think there's a difference between political campaigning to get elected and delivery of policy and action, where you need to convince a much broader mass. And I think there is a hope. There is a sort of an atmosphere where I think there's an appetite, if you like, for a more consensual form of politics and a more consensual form of government.
Alex, any thoughts on that one? Could you unmute yourself? Thank you.
Two thoughts really. The first is that despite all of the problems of partisanship, which I certainly don't dismiss in any way, I think Boris Johnson at least recognised that global Britain as an idea was meant to represent some sort of attempt at a bipartisan consensus. I question how well enunciated or delineated it was, but I do think his heart, if he has such a thing, was in the right direction. I think that really global Britain just needs a little more colour to be shaded in. Really, we need to know a little more about what it means. So I don't think it's an impossibility to come up with that task. And the second point is that history shows us that even the most divided politicians can do this. And I'm looking at Cold War America, really, where we saw the whole Cold War period really unified by, at least in foreign policy anyway, over some sort of consensus narrative about the goal and aims of foreign policy. And that was despite, you know, one can think back to the culture wars of the 60s, one can think back to Bell's critique of modern US capitalism. There were substantial criticisms going on within the US, the whole civil rights movement. US politics didn't exactly exist in a domestic vacuum. But despite that, they were able to forge some sort of consensus. I noticed that only this morning or yesterday morning, Liz Cheney, as perhaps her final parting shot at a party she no longer recognizes, called for a return to the consensus of whatever consensus there was, and we can argue about whether there was or there wasn't, of the Reagan years. And you know, very much a call for consensus on US foreign policy. So I do think it is achievable, even where the two sides of the divide are really quite far apart ideologically.
Karen, just one short and final thought from you, if I may, and that is, you know, some problems have a habit of going away. Is it possible that Russia is not really a wealthy country in terms of being an economic threat, and particularly with the oil issue with its economy? China is autocratic, and there's evidence that people get fed up with that. Is there a possibility that if we hold our nerve, then all of these problems will just go away?
I was thinking you were talking about the divisions in America when you mentioned that, because I think some of those problems may go away, but I'm not so sure Russia and China as complex challenges are going to go away in the near future. I think it's just going to get even more complicated because Russia has been highly successful, punching above its weight, using very inexpensive tools in many cases. Then China has huge economic power, and so it's just a behemoth right now on the world stage. So I don't think they're going to go away. The question is, how do we all learn to adapt and live with them, and how much compromising we do? It's not going to be about them compromising. It's actually going to be more about us compromising this time.
Karen, thank you very much indeed. Also, Graham, Alex, for a very thought-provoking and very well-researched and interesting paper, and also Simon for hosting this for Albany Associates. And thank you to you as well for joining us and posting such interesting questions. Thank you and good afternoon.